So, the truth. Before we get started on what we saw this episode, I want to go back to last time. On the previous installment of The Truth, the puzzles surrounded the several paintings of mythology or religion and what have you. You had Adam and Eve, Greek mythology and what have you, and they all had the Apple of Eden. We don't have enough information to make sense of what the heck it was talking about or trying to show, but you'll notice that they were all connected by that single similarity that you saw, that constant. There was an Apple of Eden involved in each of these somehow. What you could derive from that, well, we can't say right now. Not to dig at that too much further, let's go to what we saw in this episode. We came across three historical figures in the puzzles, each separated by a few years. You had Napoleon Bonaparte, Queen Elizabeth I, and George Washington. Supposedly, each of them could attribute their successes and legacies to the Apple of Eden in some form or fashion. Let's look at Napoleon firstly. He rose to the title of Emperor of France nearing the end of the French Revolution and was an unparalleled military leader and tactician. Before I proceed, military history is kind of one of my things, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on Napoleon more so than the others because there's something to iron out. Let me lead into this by saying that I can guarantee that as soon as I mention Napoleon, a majority of you has some sort of a caricature inside your head, probably something like a little hot-headed midget type fella. Well, to set a few things straight, first off, Napoleon was actually average height for the era, putting him around 5'7" or 170 centimeters tall. The reason behind this height issue was there was a miscalculation in converting over the era's metrics from the French standard to the British standard, and when the Brits got a hold of it and didn't carry a figure when they should have, I guess, the number came up short, and well, so did how they believed Napoleon to be, so they thought he was basically a midget compared to the normal height. Additionally, much like Hannibal to the Romans, Napoleon was used as a phantom or a boogeyman to scare children and other people into sort of better do this or Napoleon's gonna get you. And basically folks painted him as something horrendous and to be feared. Now am I saying that he sprinkled gumdrops in his wake and gave good children presents once a year? No. But the image he was painted with definitely covers up many of his achievements. As an insight into his mind, he was not a religious man, but he recognized that the advent of the church was a wonderful for retaining stability in society, a thought that's actually shared by Niccolò Machiavelli in the Renaissance. He also pushed for the Napoleonic Code, which would eventually creep its way around the world in the form of broad civil reforms. I originally had a lot more information on it, but I could go on for quite a while. It led to several huge overhauls in law that are still honored today. Now, moving on, Napoleon led his forces successfully, using groundbreaking military knowledge, which once again is still studied worldwide. His legacy, however, would hit a turning point when he set out to invade Russia in 1812. Which coincidentally is the year that that painting we saw was made and also the year that was listed in-game. Already in a long, drawn-out conflict with Spain, he decided to have a second offensive simultaneously, moving toward Russia. Now, around this point, his health and arguably his mind were deteriorating apparently. Russia in this invasion took heavy losses, but through use of scorched earth tactics in addition to campaigning on really unforgiving terrain that lacked natural supplies, the French faced a terrible defeat. Having set out with almost 600,000 troops, they returned to France with barely 100,000. Not only did famine deal with them heavily, but on their way back they had to contend with the Russian winter, which really scraped away at their numbers. And not too long thereafter, you had the Battle of Waterloo, and I don't think you need me to tell you that that didn't go too well for Napoleon. The theory here, I imagine, is that Napoleon's success was due to the apple, but he lost it in 1812, which led to his abrupt downfall. He was seen as pretty much invincible prior to his botched campaign in Russia, which showed that he was definitely not infallible. Now, as for the hand and shirt gesture, some folks say that this is due to his stomach pains he had since he died of stomach cancer. But the thing is, for starters, put yourself in his shoes. If you were getting a painting of yourself, you wouldn't want to be hunkered over favoring your pains. It'd show weakness. Now, the actual real reasoning behind why he was doing that was it was a common gesture in the century which stemmed from rhetoric teachings in ancient Greece, where it was said to be rude to speak without your arms tucked inside your toga. Moving past that, let's move on to Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth was the last ruler of the Tudor dynasty due to the fact that she never took a husband or had children. Her rule is often seen as that of a golden age, largely because many of the countries in the era were having internal issues politically, and hers was very stable in comparison. Her general approach was to rely heavily on advisors whom at the time were said to have been quite knowledgeable. Her political demeanor seemed to be along the lines of, well, walking on broken glass, I guess you could say. Given how passive she was on taking action in a number of ways, it definitely saved her from political snags, pitfalls, crossfire from alliances, or unintended goings-on that were pretty common at the time. Her behavior on topics of foreign and military policies were also quite similar to this. However, she also founded the English Protestant Church, making a clear divide against the Catholic Church itself. In spite of this, though, she was hesitant to lend aid to other Protestant countries in times of need. In spite of her passive nature on the military front, England engaged in naval warfare with the legendary Spanish Armada in 1588 and managed to come out victorious, marking the largest military victory for Elizabeth. Unfortunately, most of the other endeavors attempted previously and afterward in other lands were either lackluster or downright embarrassing. In spite of this, Spain was put in its place. The church, crown, and parliament were working together evenly for once, and the people were happy. Though this sort of positive reputation tarnished a bit in her twilight years, the reawakening of her image and legacy stuck with the English populace. It seems, though, that Assassin's Creed 2 is set on the Apple of Eden being the key to her unifying the populace, gaining its support, maintaining stability, and possibly even routing the Spanish Armada. The date listed in-game is the year of her coronation, hinting that she had it upon and maybe even prior to being crowned. Now, the orb we see in the bottom right, well, that's no Apple of Eden. That is a Globus Cruciger, or a cross-bearing orb. It is a symbol of Christ's influence over the world proper. It is typically a symbol associated with authority in the Christian world, dating back to the Middle Ages. Seeing this on the head of a ruler's scepter wasn't uncommon. Finally, we've got George Washington, the first President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. In 1781, the year listed, it is when the British suffered a critical defeat at the siege of Yorktown at the hands of the French and American forces. As for when he might have claimed the apple, well, your guess is as good as mine. He was already pretty high up and influential on a political scope prior to the war, and Yorktown is probably the largest victory. Prior to that, he launched a series of offensives against the British, but not nearly as decisive as this. The first major conflict of the war, the Battle of Long Island in 1776, was a huge defeat for Washington, so it's likely he didn't have it then. From summer through early fall of 1777, the British commander, John Burgoyne, set out to divide New England from the southern colonies. Though he had some smaller victories on the side, he was ultimately cut off, surrounded, and had to surrender. Burgoyne's defeat was what made the French finally decide to step into the war and aid the American forces. This could be seen as maybe where the apple was implied to have shown up, since this was the first turn of good luck. I'm just guessing here, honestly. Alternatively, maybe it cropped up just before the siege of Yorktown. Now, regarding the spot circled where the apple was, that's the good old hand and shirt gesture that Napoleon was sporting. Nothing more, I imagine. Something else to touch on while we're on the topic of Washington, though, this game is, in case you haven't heard, it's a little crazy on the conspiracy theories. Something to bear in mind while we're on that topic, George Washington was a Freemason. He was a member of the old Masonic order. Start folding that tinfoil, guys, because Freemasonry definitely has some tie-ins later on. Now, back to the trio of puzzles. What's the purpose? Well, it just shows that all three of these guys swapped the Apple of Eden, right? Well, not quite. If you notice the messages that accompany each puzzle screen, these are implied to be separate apples. Just as there were multiple pieces of Eden, it seems that more than one of those are actually apples. So in this case, we have apples 1, 2, and 3. All of them go their own ways after this. Also, this isn't the last we're going to hear about those 3 apples. We're going to pick up a few more clues on them later on. Trust me.
Oh!